So obviously we're going to change gears a little bit and let you guys look at some hopefully pretty pictures and talk a little bit about what has been referred to as part of that horrendous process of getting through permitting. And what we're going to take a few minutes and share with you is a couple of things. But I first wanted to start off by saying that I think everybody has one time or another talked about that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And whether we're talking about a person or an object or a landscape, you know, we tend to think that this is a subjective area and that in order to do an analysis or assessment, it is subjective. I think that what we have seen over these last few years, that in a lot of the cases, the majority, predominantly all the analysis that has been done has been subjective or qualitative. And with the occurrence and what has taken place over these last few years with these large-scale, multi-state, energy-related projects, there's becoming an ever-increasing pressure to look at things a little differently and to identify things in a more quantified way so that it becomes more defensible and transparent. So what we're going to share with you this morning very briefly is a collaborative effort that we had the honor to lead in order to develop a quantitative process to identify and analyze visual impacts, potential impacts to the landscape that results in a more defensible and transparent process. So briefly what we're going to talk about is I'm going to give you kind of the elevator spiel on the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management visual management system, and it is going to be an elevator speech. We're going to talk about our current thinking of our approach to this quantitative process, just briefly touch on some related resources, and then give you some recommendations. So what do we mean by visual resources? Generally, when we talk about scenic or visual values, we talk about those attributes or those features in a landscape that create a pattern, and we say something is scenic. We talk about this in 4 different ways. We talk about it in terms of landscape character. What is it? Is it mountainous? Is it hilly? And we term it in terms of vegetation, in terms of landform, major features, and land use. And we also talk about scenic quality. And scenic quality is simply a way of evaluating the inherent value of a landscape. All landscapes have value. And they're rated in terms of A being the most highly valued or the most highly varied or variety or distinct, and C being less. But still, all landscapes have value. Sensitivity, and what this means is the level of concern that people have. And we evaluate and we talk about what's people's level of concern. And I'll touch on that in a minute. And then visibility. Can you see it? Not only can you see it, but how far away are you from where you can see it? So it's no news for you to show you a map of the state of Wyoming. What you may not make the correlation to is the amount of lands and features within the state that are associated with some type of agency, management, governances that manages these scenic values. The darker, kind of the ochre at this color, is all the BLM administered land. There are 3 districts and 10 field offices that any type of linear project and or large area project would have to interface with, as well as the 2 national parks and 6 national forests. The other is that Wyoming is the mecca for National Historic Trails. In fact, as you know, you have the National Historic Trail Interpretive Center in Casper because of the 4 National Historic Trails that are in the state. And then something that you might not be as aware of is the program that the Federal Highway has started for several years now, and that's the National Scenic Byway. You have over 22 designated state and federal scenic byways and backways. And you also have one All-American road, which is a great honor to have in the state. Anytime you run across this, anytime you're in the area of this type of lands, means that you need to address visual or scenic resources. Typically, somebody says, well, whose authority? Well, for those who have been working on the large transmission projects, you are well aware of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or as our acronym is FLPMA, which is kind of a fun thing to say. And of course, the National Environmental Policy Act. With NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, it's the disclosure of impacts. And with FLPMA, it's the compliance with their management objectives. BLM and the Forest Service are the two, I guess, land agencies that are in the forefront of visual resource management. Both of them developed a program back in the 1970s, 80s on how to manage their visual resources. In fact, the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, has a week-long course that is actually open to anyone who has that desire to go and spend a week talking about visual resources. And then they also have follow-up courses, 3-day courses throughout, depending on the major project or the desires of the field offices. But it's really a manner that they use, a program that they use to manage the scenic values within their administered lands. There's 3 important components to the visual resource management system. First is the visual resource inventory. The next is actually the VRM, or the VRM classes, management classes, and then the third component is the contrast rating process. The visual resource inventory, or as we call it, the VRI, is a really critical part of their program. Some of the issues and delays that have been caused by some of the, as a result of some of these large projects, is because the field offices did not have their visual resource inventory completed. So therefore, they had no baseline. So the proponents, those who are trying to get projects built, had to go about the process of either waiting for them to get through the inventory, or to help pay for it to get that done and do it at that level. So that unfortunately caused a lot of delays. So in the state of Wyoming, the majority of the field offices do have their inventories done. And if there's anybody who can lobby in Washington to get a little bit more money for them to complete it, the one thing that this will do is help get the process through a little faster. Because if they have the baseline conditions, then that's something you can start from instead of having to develop it yourselves. Again, we look at sensitivity levels in basis on people, local governments, where are people going, where are the areas that they have of value, and then how far away are those areas. So most of you probably who have been working on some of these large projects are very familiar with the Brn Classes, and this is just the designated way that helps set the standards for which BLM manages, and they're rated on a class of 1 through 4, 1 being the pristine areas, the wilderness areas, 2 being areas where they want the natural landscape to be dominant, and that any activities that occur within those lands have to be very subordinate or very low-key or less visually evident. Class 3 has a lot more variability in it, and it allows for partial retention of the character, meaning that, yeah, we want to make sure that things mimic or follow or in harmony with the natural landscapes, but those activities still can occur. And Class 4 is where that you will create contrast, but that it will be okay, but you want to do what you can to minimize the changes. They use the contrast rating process to identify the activities and the level of change that they would create. The more obvious or the greater the contrast. In this case, the ski slope and cell tower, the color, the lines create the contrast that draws your eye. These things are also evaluated in terms of simulations, and this is a simulation of a pump station in southern Utah for a water pipeline, and it really is a very great tool to help assess the level of contrast. I'll let Craig talk about the specific projects.
Okay, so where we go from here? Oh, I'll talk about scenery management first. So Forest Service has a scenery management system. Used to be the visual management system. Not all of them have changed over to this yet, even though it's been around for a while. So, but they're getting there. Wyoming's pretty pretty good shape, actually. And the big change there is that it gives recognition to socially valued landscapes. So landscapes that are appealing to people, even though they've been developed in some way, are given attention, whereas the BLM system doesn't quite go to that level. So the current thinking as far as analyzing these projects is you have to start with an inventory of the visual resources. Now, if BLM has some of that information or all that information in some cases, that's great. The VRIs can be a real mixed bag even if they're supposedly done. They can be sort of partially done or the data's not quite there where it's usable without quite a bit of work. What we've done is broken the landscape into landscape analysis units, and that works really well with the BLM system, somewhat with the Forest Service system depending on how they were delineated, but they can follow the Scenic Quality rating units, which simplifies things greatly. These are just essentially like areas of the landscapes that are also rated to give them scenic quality ratings, like a numerical rating. And then inventory of the management objectives. We've got obviously BLM and Forest Service, but also the trails and scenic roads, state and local plans, things of that nature. If we think of then going to on more of a site-specific basis, identification of stationary and linear sensitive viewing platforms. These are the areas in the landscape where people gather, where people, there's going to be higher numbers of people looking at the landscape for some particular reason. This is a good example here that the marker here, I believe, sits out on a roadside. So there's some users that are coming to a point location at this marker, looking over the landscape, getting back in their car, and leaving. That's different than those that are actually traveling this historic trail in a linear fashion. They're looking in one direction, they might be looking in another direction. It's a very different experientially than standing in a static point and looking, sometimes only in one direction. So to talk quickly about the effects on views from these platforms is, what are the visibility conditions? The top photo with the transmission line, can we just see about this much and then that transmission line turns and goes down so we're just seeing about that much of it? Are some of those transmission lines partially obscured by the landscape, by the hills that are in front of them? Or not. If you're just seeing the tops of them, that's a different case than if you can see an entire one. If they're skylined, that's much different than if they're backdropped, because they're much harder to see when they get backdropped, especially as you back up further. And then when we get into angle and duration of view, picture again with either one of these photos, if you're out at a static point and you're looking directly at those, would be completely different than if you're traveling a road that's going not directly towards these, but it's paralleling these. And it's much less noticeable if it's out in the periphery in general terms. And then the angle of view, do you have, is it in 10% of your total 360-degree view, or is it, 180 degrees? Does it take a right turn around you and become almost 270 degrees around you? You can start to put measurements to those. And that's where we come into the quantification. The duration of view, as you're traveling down a road, you can, you can start to talk about how long are you going to see it? How many minutes, if you're moving at 65 miles an hour down this particular road, how many minutes are you going to actually see that for? And then you can do the same thing with the amount of project components visible. Are you seeing 5% of the project? Are you seeing 90% of the project? And you can start to use those percentages to compare things much easier. And then it all comes back down to the degree of visual contrast and the dominance. How dominant is that project in that landscape? And that's what ties back to the management objectives for BLM and Forest Service. Just real quickly, this is a pipeline in the red and blue and a scenic road crossing this pipeline, or a pipeline crossing a scenic road. The the blue on the pipeline shows where you would not actually, it would not actually be visible from the scenic road, and the red is where it would be visible. You can add up that total mileage, you can compare it to other things. Effects of the landscape. This is zooming back out again and trying to get to that quantifiable data is, let's say we're going through a Class A scenic quality area, and we can look at the numbers of how that was scored. We can say if we add this project, the cultural modification score is going to lower. It's going to go negative for areas that can see it. And so we can get numbers from that really quickly. If it's going to raise it, if it's going to lower it 2 points and it's going to make it a B landscape instead of an A, that's kind of a big deal, especially to the BLM. And also, we can associate the visible acres to that. So is it a large acreage of A? Is it a small acreage of A? Gives us more to work with. These same sort of things can be done on special management areas such as WSAs and wilderness areas, ACECs. There's not really a compliance issue there, since if they're not crossing them necessarily, but there is an effect because they're in the same view shed often. So I think we went over a lot of this. It's quantitative analysis we're trying to get to. Acres of impact to scenic quality A is very important to the BLM in particular, but Forest Service also has concerns there as well. And then getting to those numbers of miles, acreage, duration of impacts. This all results in a more defensible and transparent process that in some cases in the past has been sort of a black box that goes in. There's no numbers associated with it, and it comes out at the end. Yes, we think it's a high impact. No, we think it's a low impact, but there's nothing to really support it well. As far as compliance, we've mentioned you're basically dealing primarily with BLM and U.S. Forest Service if you're crossing their lands, but also the scenic byways and the trails come into play. On-site and regional mitigation. So in this case here, understanding the landscape's absorption capabilities, this has got pretty low absorption capability. Essentially what that's getting at is the more variability in that landscape, the easier it is to hide projects in it, in general terms. Also, the visual prioritization process, which the Federal Highways developed, I think in coordination a bit with Forest Service, will tell you if this is a scenic point, and I'm not sure why it would be, but if this is a scenic point, a scenic viewing point, maybe doing a bunch of mitigation at this particular spot makes a lot of sense, and on the back side of this hill makes less sense to spend as much funds on there. So it's kind of prioritizing those areas. And then regional mitigation, which I think someone mentioned earlier this morning. BLM seems to be sort of moving towards that. So if you can't mitigate well on your site, maybe there's something else in the region that you can put funds toward and keep things moving along. Skip through that. The Wyoming Protocol is a programmatic agreement. It's a really long actual name, so we just call it the Wyoming Protocol. I think there's 38 words in it, in just the title. Essentially, what it brought up for the first time, brought to the forefront, is that properties that are eligible or listed on the NRHP, and also traditional cultural properties, they have a landscape setting component to them, meaning that if you make a change in the view shed of that, you could affect the eligibility of that site for the National Register, and BLM wants to know that specifically. So that takes a lot of early coordination between your cultural and your visual resource specialists. It ties right into historic trails. NPS is the lead on historic trails, but there's not that much historic trails on NPS lands because nobody wanted to travel through really scenic, rugged land. They stuck to BLM, what ended up being BLM lands. BLM has 3 manuals, but the most important is Manual 6280, which came out a couple of years ago. There is a lot to Manual 6280. It's a big process, and it pulls together a lot of different resources. But there are management plans and corridors associated with it. Some of them aren't fully developed. There's a nature and purpose statement to each one. High potential sites and segments are the most critical areas of those. The inventory and analysis is a pretty heavy workload because you're pulling together visual resources, cultural resources, the historic setting, whether it looks like it used to back in that particular day. And one of the difficulties right now is that manual prescribes outcomes. It doesn't talk about methodologies. So there's all different potential methodologies to use there to get to it. I think everybody's sort of struggling through that. What's the best way to do it? So when it comes down to it, so what? What does it matter? What are the recommendations? Address visual resources really early. They get left to last minute quite a bit, and it's time consuming. And it also can hold up visual impacts to historic properties, national historic trails. It can sort of domino other things. Identify the agencies that you're dealing with. Confirm existence of data, especially VRI data and trails data, because trails data can be quite messy. There's a lot of different data out there with trails in different locations. They can vary as much as 10 miles from each other. There's all different kinds of braids when you get into it and get the actual cultural data. There can be 5 different trails in one location, all braided together. Complete visibility analysis, and that'll let you know the area that you're dealing with, and agree on viewing platforms, especially with the agencies and any counties or anyone involved, and document the reasons for why those viewing platforms are used. And then prepare a quantitative analysis. I think that's where things are really headed to make things more defensible.
Well,
thank you for your
Question
time.
from the board?
So as as technology continues to improve, what do you guys think is the next sort of breakthrough in visual stuff? Do you see drone type applications on trails and a lot of that digital stuff to be something that becomes more and more what people are doing for looking at those impacts?
That could be. Yeah, we've been checking into drones some. We had one at the office the other day. We struggle to see exactly how it would fit with visual. Trails might be a better application in some respects, although there's 2 components there. There is, the reason trails people are called rut nuts, and they fully accept that, is because they used to always look down. That used to be the only thing important to them. They didn't care anything about the setting. Now it's the 2 things in combination. And that's really just changed over the last couple of years since the Wyoming Protocol came out and the National Trails 6280 manual came out. But I think GIS modeling is just huge, and it just keeps getting better and better, and the models keep getting more complex. But there's a lot that can improve there as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the timeline? Is this part of these processes that you have to go through for permit applications? Can you talk about how much time that takes, and is there like fixed gate schedules? And
usually if one of the things we've always asked for is to be brought in on a new project, because we keep being brought in on projects that are already down the path and they need to be fixed. But what we didn't ask for was the amount of time. So we can fit easily in with the other resources, things that do we know what the project is, what the realm of the alternatives, where is it going to go, or potentially going to go. And then we can do our work pretty darn quickly relative to others, because unlike biology, you don't have formal Section 7 consultation, you don't have the 135 days, and with the historic resource, you don't have to go to the tribes or, to that extent. So we can usually get our work done, depending on the project, without holding up anybody. And one of the good things about what we've developed in collaboration with BLM and the Forest Service is that what we can do is now help in the alternative evaluation, that it's not just, oh, it's high, medium, or low, but we get to the number of miles, the number of acres, so that in fact helps the process. So I think that it's not a delay if you start early or when everybody else starts, but we typically are brought in when the draft is due out in 2 months and nobody knows where anything is, and that's the real issue. But it shouldn't be going forward any type of delay in the process.
I can follow up then. So probably early in a project, people have architectural, conceptual drawings and illustrations, and so if you use that in the permitting application and so forth, and as they go through the detailed design and you know the timeline, and they make how much of a change is substantive enough that you would have to maybe do an amendment to that permit? Is how rigid is this, or how much flexibility do we have?
It depends on a couple of things. One is if all of a sudden you decide you're going to put wind turbines as part of your project. So you're going up in scale. That would have a huge factor on visibility. If you're moving in alignment, 20 feet or 50 feet, that's not going to have that much of an impact. It's more like we were just finishing up a pipeline and trying to get out where the pump stations were. That's a big factor because you've got lines, you've got transmission coming in, you've got above ground structures. So if you're going to move those materially, that could, so because we have to go back and run our visibility and take a quick look at everything.
So if someone was starting on a wind farm project and it just a next generation turbines came out with taller towers, and that's another 10, 20 meters tall, would that require?
10, 20 meters, yes. 10 feet, no.
Questions, audience? Well, let's give these guys a hand. Thank you so much. Good
Thank
job.
you so very much.